The situation as it currently stands is unacceptable and untenable. Canadians have been patient. Our government has been patient. But it has been 2 weeks, and the barricades need to come down now.
It's day 16 of ongoing rail blockades across the country, and the Prime Minister says he's run out of patience. Hi there and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Kapelos. In a major shift of both language and tone, the Prime Minister is now saying the blockades have gone on too long. He says dialogue with chiefs haven't been productive and the onus for resolution now rests with Indigenous leaders. Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs and their Mohawk supporters have said they will not allow trains to pass until the RCMP is completely out of their territory and Coastal GasLink employees stop working on Wet'suwet'en territory while, quote, nation-to-nation talks take place. The blockade outside Montreal, one of the blockades in this country, this one is in Saint-Lambert, Quebec. It remains up even after Quebec police served a court injunction to protesters last evening. We also have our eyes on the Tyendinaga blockade near Belleville, Ontario, where Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs are with their Mohawk counterparts today. Chief Woos, who we'll be speaking to soon, laid out his conditions for the barricades to come down. He says the RCMP not only remain on their territory, but he claims they've become more aggressive.
The Hereditary Chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en confirmed at the meeting that the BC RCMP and the CIRG have in fact increased harassment, made illegal arrests, increased surveillance and monitoring of Wet'suwet'en people and their invited guests. This is completely unacceptable and far from the show of good faith and contradicts an announcement by the BC RCMP.
As I mentioned, the Prime Minister is saying today it's time for court injunctions to be enforced. Bill Blair is the Minister of Public Safety. He joins us in studio. Hi, Minister Blair.
Hello.
24 hours ago, you sat here and you said there was reason to be optimistic because of the BC RCMP's willingness to move where it was stationed in BC and around Wet'suwet'en territory. You express optimism that the conditions were set for talks to happen, for progress to be made. What changed?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, there have been ongoing discussions between the RCMP in British Columbia and the Hereditary Chiefs. There was a request from the Hereditary Chiefs during those discussions that the RCMP would move their officers from the roadway that had been opened by virtue of the power of the injunction. Just 2 days ago, the RCMP agreed to do that. They are in the process now of doing exactly what they said they would do. I think it was a very positive move, and it was directly responsive to what the Hereditary Chiefs said they wanted. But we have been making continuous efforts over the past 4 days to reach out to them and to engage them in dialogue. We've been unsuccessful in getting them to engage us in that dialogue. And quite frankly, as I said yesterday, it is time for those barricades to come down. We, as a government, recognize that the impact that this is having on everyday Canadians, and we need those protesters to recognize it as well. And so the Prime Minister today made it very clear. Those barricades must come down. There is an injunction in place. It should be obeyed, and the law needs to be upheld. We still want that to be resolved peaceably, but we are urging those who have put those barricades up, stop impeding those trains, let people get back to work, let goods move along those rail lines. We are still committed to the reconciliation agenda. We are still open to ongoing dialogue to resolve any issues still in dispute. But, it can't be a one-way thing. The government has been prepared and has reached out. The RCMP responded directly to the request that had been made, and now additional demands are being put on the table remotely, but they haven't come to the table and they haven't engaged directly with us.
So are you saying basically because the RCMP said that they would move and another request was made for conversation with the Hereditary Chiefs and they didn't take anyone up on the offer, that all of a sudden the federal government decided, okay, that's it, now those blockades have to come down?
It's not all of a sudden. We've been in this discussion for well over a week.
But what you have said, what the Prime Minister said today was markedly different than what he said in the past 4 days.
Well, 4 days ago, he urged them to come to the table and to engage in us in dialogue. Some important things have happened over the last 4 days. The RCMP agreed to change their posture on the territory, and exactly as they had originally asked the RCMP to do, and we reached out. But in the past 4 days, we also have seen a significantly increased impact that this is having on average everyday Canadians. People are being laid off. Goods can't get to the factories. People who rely on those goods for their jobs and their livelihoods and their ability to support their families and their communities aren't able to work. Layoffs are happening. And so there's an urgency to this that unfortunately some of the people who we've been trying to engage in dialogue seem to have been indifferent to. And so we're not indifferent to the suffering that everyday Canadians right across the country are feeling. And the Prime Minister has been very clear today. He's asked for those barricades to come down. It's time. And there's an injunction in place in many of these places. That law should be obeyed. It should be upheld. We're not giving instructions to the police.
Yeah,
the police have an important job to do, but they're
so
directed by the police are directed by the law, by their legal authorities, and by the obligations imposed upon them by the law and the courts. They also are informed by their training, their policies, and their procedure. And so they'll do their job, and their job is to do it as peaceably as it can possibly be achieved. But our urgent request of those who are barricading those rail lines is to take those barricades down, let the trains move, and we also want to assure them that we are not in any way wavering from our commitment to ongoing dialogue on the Indigenous reconciliation agenda.
Sorry to interrupt, but they've said that they're not going to do that. So what actually changes? So the barricades, the Prime Minister has said now is the time for them to come down. They have said they're not going to do so. So what happens now?
There are injunctions in place. The continuation of those barricades being maintained there is unlawful and contrary to the injunctions. We want the people that on those barricades to obey the law, to take those barricades down, and to allow the trains to resume.
And what if they
we
don't?
also want them to come back to continue in the dialogue that we have been trying to undertake with them. If they don't, there are other measures that others will have responsibility. It's ultimately the provincial jurisdiction and the police of jurisdiction
like what?
will have responsibility. Well, again, I'm not the government, and I'm going to be very careful. The government is not instructing or directing the police in any way.
No, but
the police
Canadians are looking to the federal government right now when they say it's time for those blockades to come down. They're looking to the federal government, to your government, to find out what is your plan to ensure that they do come down.
Well, and the plan is to ensure that we as a nation uphold the rule of law. Injunctions are in place. The barricades are unlawful, and there are legal remedies for that. But I'm very hopeful, I remain hopeful that those who are on those barricades will recognize the impact that this is having on ordinary Canadians, and they will follow the Prime Minister's urging. It's time for those barricades to come down. It's time for the harm that is being done to ordinary Canadians to cease. It's unacceptable. It's untenable. It has to stop. And for those who wish to engage in a dialogue with us, we're here and we're waiting, and we're open to that dialogue, but the barricades must come down and the trains must be allowed to continue to move.
Are you saying that if those protesters stay there blockading those lines wherever they may be in Canada and injunctions are there to be enforced, that they should be arrested?
Again, the way in which the police choose to uphold those injunctions and to enforce them and to affect the lawful purpose of opening up those rail lines, I'm not going to instruct. The police know what they're doing, and they've done this many times in the past.
But the difference is that the thing is that they've resisted doing so, right?
No,
For example, in
disagree.
Tyendinaga. No, I'm saying in Tyendinaga, they have resisted going in and enforcing the injunction in a way that would stop the barricade. I take your point that they're making calculations and that they're doing a lot on the ground. But what's happened is that barricade persists, right? So if they have yet to go in, what's going to change today?
The police on site at all of these locations where these barricades have taken place are committed to resolving this peaceably. And as long as there was productive dialogue taking place that could lead to a peaceful resolution and the removal of those barricades, I think the police are going to give it every opportunity to succeed. But what is very clear, now 4 days after the Prime Minister asked them to come to the table, and they have declined to engage with us, that allowing the harm that is occurring as a result of these rail blockades to continue to persist and to hurt everyday Canadians is not acceptable to us. And so we've said to those who are on those barricades and blockading those trains, those blockades must come down. And there are legal mechanisms that are in place, and the people responsible for upholding those laws will follow the law, their training, and the court's direction in achieving that. And I am also confident that they will do everything possible to resolve that current unacceptable situation as peaceably as possible.
When you say that you're open to that dialogue, your government is open to that dialogue, is there anybody, any hereditary chief that has reached out to have that kind of dialogue?
Yes, there have been discussions with hereditary chiefs who have been willing to speak to us, and actually that has been very productive. But unfortunately, those who have perhaps been most vocal and have now the growing list of demands have declined to engage in any meaningful dialogue with us. And in the absence of that, we have no choice but to say the barricades must come down now. And urge those who are on those barricades to step back from that, recognize the harm that they are doing, and we will continue to invite them back to the table for discussion, but the barricades must come down.
The hereditary chiefs that are in discussions or are engaging in dialogue with the federal government, have they showed any willingness to remove those barricades? What I'm trying to get at is there a difference in the positions that are being expressed?
There is a difference in the positions, but again, that's an ongoing dialogue, and I don't think it's appropriate to necessarily be revealing the nature of that discourse. But there are hereditary chiefs that we have been in discussion with who are very open to dialogue and far more positive in their engagement. But unfortunately, those who are more directly involved in the barricades have not come to the table and not been the RCMP, I think, quite appropriately responded to one of the primary concern that they said was their concern, and having addressed that concern, it apparently, and I only say apparently because they have not told it to us, but they've made other public pronouncements that it's not good enough and they have many more demands.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Minister Blair. Appreciate your time. Public Safety Minister Bill Blair.
Thank you, Vashi.
We've heard the government side of this standoff. The Prime Minister saying the onus to resolve the issues is now on Indigenous leaders. Now we want to bring in Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chief Woos, who met with Mohawk chiefs today. He joins us from the site of the Ontario blockade in Tyendinaga. Hi, Chief Woos. Can you hear me okay? It's Vashi.
Yes, I can hear you.
Chief Woos, can I ask you for your reaction to what the Prime Minister said today, that the blockades have to come down?
Well, we weren't surprised. I think one of the things that he made clear was that peaceful resolution, so we're going to hold on to that.
So can I ask you, though, the Prime Minister said that the RCMP in BC had announced, or they had signaled their intent to move their positioning in BC, and that because you had stipulated that that was a condition of discussions with the federal government, they had done so. How come that doesn't appear to be enough to start those discussions?
Office at the 29 kilometer, sending a letter and saying that closure is one thing, but actually doing the physical movements, the physical removal of all the trailers that they put on there, that's what we'd like to see.
So I just want to be clear, if you were to see all of that, are you willing to talk to the federal government?
That's precisely what we're saying.
So, I think that we've had a camera issue. My apologies. So, again, though, the press release today said that you also wanted Coastal GasLink to cease all operations. Is it just the RCMP that you want removed from the area, or do you also want that?
The press, we want to keep consistent here. The RCMP have to be moving out of our territory.
So it's just the RCMP that you're looking for, and then you're willing to talk to the Prime Minister or talk to people in the federal government?
That's right.
So what do you think then that the Prime Minister today said, and members of his government, that the RCMP, they basically gave a timeline, that announcement came yesterday from the RCMP. They feel as though they've given enough opportunities for dialogue with hereditary chiefs like yourself, and now they say the onus is on you. What do you say to that?
enough time for dialogue. You know, when the injunction was enforced by the RCMP, they've given us a 7-day period. And Mr. Horrigan in BC wanted and mentioned in his BC website that Wosks table was the way to do it. And then what they did was they hired a liaison named Nathan Cullen. We only had a 2-day meeting, and then all of a sudden CGL turned around and says that wasn't good enough, and so they told the police to enforce the injunction, and that's where the whole thing started to boil over. So it's a matter of words and then and the commitments. If Mr. Trudeau says that he's willing to talk, by all means, we're open to that. And in this case, with his media release, what we've heard within the last 48 hours, that you know, the dialogue attempt that they had was running out of time. I'm confused about that, because we're just waiting for the RCMP to remove themselves, and then we're open to talking to them.
And have you communicated that? Have you and your colleagues communicated that to the federal government? Because what they said to reporters today was that they've had no response to that.
That's false information. We were in constant communication with Mark Miller and Bennett. And so they're just twisting our words. I'm not going to fall for that.
So what happens, Chief Woos, with the blockades now? Do you anticipate that they will, what is your intent, that the blockades remain until the RCMP leave or until you talk to the federal government? What sort of, can you help our viewers understand what the plan is?
I think just before the Mr. Trudeau came on with his live report, I did contact Mr. Miller, and Mr. Miller told me that to hear out or to look out for movement over at kilometer 99. So we got eyes on the ground out there. We want to see movement. We'll see what that meant when Mr. Miller told me that.
What do you think that means? Sorry, what might that mean?
That means the RCMP are starting to make the movements out of there physically.
And if that happens, is there a willingness on your part to remove the blockades?
That's the general plan.
Okay, thank you, Chief Woos. I appreciate your time today very much.
You're very welcome.
There will always be moments of difficulty, but we need to be able to work through it together. And I am hopeful that Indigenous leadership over the coming hours and day will see that in order to continue on this peaceful and important path, those barricades need to come down.
That was the Prime Minister not too long ago, putting the onus on Indigenous leaders to resolve the dispute that has led to 16 days of rail blockades across this country. Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs say they want the RCMP out of their territory and pipeline work to stop while negotiations take place. Premiers made their positions clear to the Prime Minister on a conference call last night. How did the call go? Did the Prime Minister go far enough today? Scott Moe is the Premier of Saskatchewan. He joins us now from Saskatoon. Hi, Premier Moe. Nice to see you. Thanks for your time again today.
Great to see you as well, Vashi.
Let me start off with what the Prime Minister said today. His basically sort of a change in tone, a change in language, saying the barricades now have to come down. How much of what was discussed with the premiers do you think had an impact on what the Prime Minister said today?
Most certainly what we saw being discussed today by the Prime Minister largely reflected the phone call that the Prime Minister had and the Deputy Prime Minister with Premiers last evening, understanding and the urgency or increasing urgency of this situation, understanding the fact that Canadians have largely been very patient over the course of the last few weeks, and understanding there is an opportunity for dialogue, but also understanding that we do live in a country where the rule of law is paramount, that these barricades do need to come down, and are there opportunities for them to come down in a peaceful but rapid manner. And so what we saw today largely represented the discussion that we had last night and with all of the premiers, and I commend the Prime Minister to his approach. Was
there a consensus among the premiers on this issue?
There was a discussion last night. We did not look for consensus with respect to the call last night, but we had a good discussion with the Prime Minister. I think you saw it largely reflected the facts of that discussion in his comments here today, and this is, I believe, a good step forward in this nation for us to come to a peaceful resolve.
I didn't mean sort of, I guess I should have been more clear, a formal measurement of consensus. I guess I'm trying to ascertain the level of pressure on the Prime Minister applied by the premiers, and if it was sort of a group message or certain premiers individually were making the message, because it wasn't that way at the beginning of the week. There were premiers, for example, like Premier Kenney, who were saying more forceful things than other premiers, but was it a concerted message, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Most certainly, I believe there's a consensus among premiers that the barricades that did need to come down and that we need to work together to find a peaceful and rapid way for that to occur. So we had a good discussion last night. We saw most of that, if not all of it, reflected in the Prime Minister's comments here today, and hopefully now we will see some steps forward. There's an opportunity for those that have erected these barricades to take them down on their own and continue with their dialogue, or like has happened in many other provinces, there has been injunctions that have been sought and granted, and the law enforcement have moved and removed those barricades, and there's an opportunity here for provincial police agencies, municipal police agencies to possibly join with a coordinated approach from the federal law enforcement agency, the RCMP, to ultimately act if they need to. But it would be my hope that those that have erected these barricades will remove them and have take the Prime Minister up on the opportunity for dialogue that has been offered.
Have there been any discussions about that kind of a coordinated law enforcement approach?
That there is responsibilities across the board with respect to injunctions that have been sought. Ultimately, there is, here's the example that I use in Saskatchewan. We have no barricades, but we are being impacted to a large degree by the barricades that are in other provinces. So there is a need for a federal approach to this, and but there is also, I think, a need, in fairness, for all of us to approach this together as provinces, territories, and the federal government, and we've seen that occur with the conference calls that have occurred over the last day or so.
I guess what I'm trying to get at, though, is there actually some sort of formal coordination happening? Because from a federal perspective, they have changed their language today, right, but they're still saying we don't direct the RCMP, right? And obviously there's provincial jurisdiction here as well, right? The OPP doesn't fall under the federal government.
We certainly, no level of government directs any level of law enforcement. How the law enforcement operates, the resources that they request from other law enforcement agencies, they operate at their discretion. What is not at their discretion is whether or not they enforce the law. What is not at their discretion is whether or not they actually enforce a court order. So we have both of the court order has been granted, like it has in many other provinces, and we would hope that the law enforcement agencies would act at their discretion to ensure that the law is enforced. That is why we have them.
Those laws, those injunctions were granted earlier, right? They weren't just granted today. And so far, depending on the blockade, and it's specific in each circumstance, but for example, in Ontario, one of the big blockades that's impacting a ton of the CN operations, for example, the OPP has not gone in and arrested people, right? They have so far resisted. They've said that's up to them. They've made a calculation. My question, and it was also to the federal minister today, the Minister of Public Safety, is what changes today? Why all of a sudden will the OPP, is there something that's happened or a message that goes out to them? Obviously, everyone's saying we don't direct them, but How then do Canadians know that something will change today?
Well, I think what we see today are very clear statements from the Prime Minister representing the Government of Canada, statements that match those of a number of provinces over the course of the last number of days, that it is the expectation of governments that law enforcement will enforce the law and will enforce court injunctions that have been granted. In this country, we have a democracy where the elected parliamentarians and legislatures create the laws, the courts interpret those laws, and our law enforcement agencies enforce them. It's at their discretion as to how they enforce them, but it's not at their discretion as to whether or not they do. And we saw that language being laid out very clearly by the Prime Minister today. It's been laid out by provinces. And I would put forward it's the expectation of the vast majority of Canadians that is the case.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, Premier Moe. Pleasure to have you on as always.
Thank you, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.